Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to be wrapping up what has really been a very tumultuous first year of our mock rebuild that we started this offseason. We're going to go through just everything that happened over the last half of the year, final record for the team, roster moves that were made late in the season, and take a little bit of a look forward on, how do we start building this thing up. So, if you guys have not watched the previous videos, you can go check them out on the channel. There should be a playlist including all these. We had one in the offseason for all the offseason moves. We had one at the trade deadline for everything that happened in the first half of the year. Now we're going to be wrapping up everything for the last half of the year. And before we jump into this, I want to reiterate something here. Once again, as we've talked about throughout this year has been a very heavy emphasis on starting a review, right? We're not sitting here going all in on this season. And I think at the end of the day, that was a very good decision because you look at the real life team. They just finished their last game. They went 4-13 after spending tons of money in free agency and doing everything they could for this front office and coaching staff to save their jobs. Now, front office seems to have potentially saved their jobs right now. Trent Baalke's not fired. It's possible that he gets moved on from if a head coach comes in and is listened to and saying they don't want to work with him. But we don't know that for a fact. So we'll see what happens there. But for me, I looked at this thing. I didn't like the cap situation. I didn't like the way this team was spending. I thought the void years were getting ridiculous. And my goal was to reset in year one. I think we've done a good job of that, but obviously what comes with that is a team that was even worse this year. We didn't go out and spend a bunch. We fired Doug Peterson in the last one early in the season, and so not good results in the year. So we'll go ahead, we'll jump into this, we'll talk about it as we go through. Couple of things, kind of the big events that took place. Connor Williams retiring was not something that I had planned for. I never thought I'd have to deal with a mid-season retirement, let alone the first year. But this actually happened for the Seattle Seahawks. He was playing as our right guard in this. JPJ was our center. And so I ended up losing that player, but thankfully Greg Van Roden was someone else we had brought in during the offseason. He played all right for the Giants this year, was very cost-effective for sure. And so we had him on this team to fill in for Connor Williams after the retirement took place. The other big event was the Trevor Lawrence injury. Now, it was interesting because I was someone who I wanted to ideally be able to to bench Trevor Lawrence and let him rest up and get surgery after he had the AC joint sprain. Because I didn't want him to get hurt, right? And if he gets hurt really bad, you don't want to jeopardize 2025, which in this scenario, there was no extension, right? Lawrence has one more year left on his contract after this season. So, do you really want to jeopardize that year? At the same time, though, is Lawrence going to really sit down and take that surgery knowing that he only has one more year? It's going to be with a new head coach and whole lot of new things with this team. Is he going to really stop playing? And I think at the end of the day, probably wouldn't have. I think he would have ended up staying and playing it out. And, you have probably the same result with the Aziz Al-Shaair hit that ultimately, finished things off to where Lawrence is not playing anymore this year. So that was an event that happened. I didn't expect him to be out for the rest of the season. It's part of the reason why Mac Jones was moved to the Dolphins at the trade deadline, just trying to get another pick, maybe a throw at a kicker in the draft, because that's another need for this team. And so, kind of unfortunate how that turned out because, well, you kind of could have used Mac Jones. But at the same time, it probably helped you secure a top pick in the draft, not having him. So, Michael Pratt, he was our pick in the 4th round. He did not play for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this year. That was where he eventually went after getting released by the Packers, who took him at 245 in the draft. He is someone who is looked at as the future backup there, so I'm sure he's going to be a part of this. But can't really say how he would have played this year because he was never on the field. So we just generally kind of expected him to be maybe a tick below what Mac Jones was doing on the field, given he's a rookie and he's not actually playing for any team this year. So those were our big events here. Now, moving forward, we'll just go through all the final roster moves because, well, had a lot of guys go on season-ending IR. We had a guy retire, and we had to pull people from the practice squad. So you start with Lawrence, going on season-ending IR. Brian Hoyer was ultimately who I brought in at quarterback. There wasn't really any names that ended up playing this year that were still available at that point. So I just brought in someone I felt like, hey, probably would have been a veteran, could help out with Michael Pratt, since he's the only quarterback you have left at that point. And then, Connor Williams, as I said, ends up going on the reserve retired list. And then Chandler Brewer was someone I thought made sense to replace him, someone who's been here in the past, just to add to the offensive line for the rest of the year. We had signed DJ Humphries in the last video we had. And unfortunately, I had to rescind that because he wanted to go to a competitor. He got paid more than what I offered. And so that probably wouldn't have happened. So we went with Charles Leno Jr., who had played last year for the Commanders. He didn't get signed to a team this year. So this year's kind of hard because a lot of these players, they just didn't get picked up. And we had to pick someone up for a lot of these guys who started getting hurt late in the year. So it's hard to know what would have happened, but we're obviously guessing probably subpar play if you aren't on the field this year as a starter or even a backup. And then you got Evan Ingram going on season-ending IR. We promoted Blake Bell to the active roster, former Kansas City Chief, one of their depth players for quite a while. And then Tyler Croft was who we added to the practice squad just to try to fill things out there. So nothing too inspiring here, right? I mean, we're at a point where I think we were 1-9 going into the last video. I mean, the season's over. You lost your quarterback. You're not looking to make big splash plays here. You're just trying to get through the season. And so these were the players that were available I thought would be best. Speaking of the final record for this team, we're going to talk about that, how these games went, and then just give some final grades to everything. And then look forward to what is the offseason going to look like? How do you start turning this around? Because this is the point of the rebuild where you're adding to the roster, right? You're not just accumulating draft picks and getting rid of players for wherever you can get. That's done at this point. So, final record for this team. I don't think they would have won an air game. The real life team, the only differences in the schedule was the Colts in week 5, which, keep in mind, Jacksonville held on by a thread in that game. I mean, that was close because they went up, I think it was 2 touchdowns. It was like 34-20. They blew that lead in a minute in that game. In 1 minute. I think thanks to Alec Pierce. And then kicked the game-winning field goal at the very end. Ended up winning it. It was a really close game. And the Titans games, both down to the wire as well. I mean, the Titans, I think, nearly got to the red zone in the first one and did the same thing in the second, trying to make up the gap. With a team that is just a little bit worse, I think you're losing a lot of these games. The record looks a lot different, but that's probably how it would have turned out. So a lot of similar results here. You still have the big loss to the Lions, probably going down the same way. The Vikings was one, almost ended up being a win because, that was a really bad game for Mac Jones. So if you have any other quarterback in there that's playing like okay, you might have beat them. But obviously that didn't end up happening. But ultimately, a lot of similar results, just not as much offense. The big difference here, looking at the real life team, imagine what the Jaguars would be without Brian Thomas Jr. It's not good, right? And we didn't draft Brian Thomas Jr. because, like 99% of the fans before the draft, we were not thinking Brian Thomas Jr. was the best pick that would be available when the Jaguars were on the clock, even in a trade back. Obviously, we're all wrong. We're happy for it. BTJ's a Jaguar. hopefully for life. But that's something we're going to have to live with here. We've talked about that before. So, final record for the year. Very disappointing. 1-16. But, that's part of it. I mean, you got a team that we were already not going all in on this year. And then you have the insane collapse they have in real life to fall to 4-13. It's going to be even worse in this scenario. But at the same time, is there a reward for that? Yeah, there is, right? Because you're sitting here at 116 and you're in the first overall pick. And there's going to be options with that. That's going to be a big thing this offseason. What we can do with that, the type of players that we can add, and all those different things. But that's ultimately where the schedule ended up playing out and where this team finished on the year. So we'll go back. We'll do our final grades. We're going to do acquisitions, our extensions, and then we're going to talk about our draft grades. So looking at free agency, this was honestly just kind of a disaster for this team. And then you also have some trades here as well with Greg Newsome II, John Mechie III, and Mac Jones. But with Davenport, he played pretty well the first game of the year, and then he got hurt. He was out for the season, just like that. So $7.5 million is down the drain here on a player who barely played for you. And he was part of the reason why you were comfortable moving on, maybe from Trayvon Walker, if you got a great deal for him. And then he gets hurt the second that you do that. So it's a really unfortunate situation because, it's not what you expected. He could have absolutely been worth that money if he'd stayed healthy, but Davenport got hurt instantly. So he was out for the year. It's got to be an F because of that. Mike Williams gave it a D. You could maybe go a little bit higher on this, but, you ended up trading him eventually. He played fine. He wasn't, incredible or anything, but probably a little bit less than what you were hoping for. And you do get a 5th-round pick out of it. That's good. You get something for the future that you can use. But just wasn't really the hit you were expecting. And if I could go back, I'm not spending on a contract like that. Now, Jeff Okudah, man, that is a horrible year for him. Same thing with injuries. Just before the year even started, the guy was on IR. So you barely saw him this year. And when he played, it was not good for the Houston Texans. So it's just a disaster for him. Very unfortunate. You got Connor Williams here as well. Ends up retiring mid-season. There's some bad luck involved here. There's some bad decision making too. But some things that are pretty ridiculous did happen too. So Connor Williams, it's a cheap deal. He played fine for the Seahawks this year. He had some snapping issues for them because he was playing center. I don't think you have those at right guard. So, is he a solid acquisition? Yeah, but you don't even get a full year out of it. And, to be fair, with that said, you're not paying him the full $3 million, but that's kind of where things land. Greg Newsome II, I think this one's going to be a miss for us as far as acquiring a player. You get in someone you're hoping fits the scheme better, is a man coverage, is a man coverage corner, someone with a lot of upside, former 1st-round pick, and he just had a down year for the Browns. Just did not play well this year, struggled, was below average. The good thing here with the contract, at least, is that you have the bigger cap hit this year. If you can find a team that would take on that deal to give him a shot, maybe you got to pay some of the cap, you're not paying him the vast majority of this money. It was like $2 million or something this year. So it's possible to get out of that, and it's maybe not as bad as it looked. But ultimately, it's a miss, and you wish you had your 4th and 6th round pick back at the end of the day. Now, John Mechie III, he's honestly been fine. And I think he was a solid acquisition. The Texans have been using him a little bit, so he's been on the field. He's had some good snaps, some good games. But ultimately, not a huge difference maker. Would have been on the field, of course, a ton with this team, just given the injuries and the lack of players we ended up having, and Christian Kirk going out for the year and all this stuff. But ultimately, just kind of an average sort of deal there for this year. And then Mac Jones, I just gave it a D because of the decision to move on and then having Lawrence get hurt basically the moment that Mac Jones is out of the building. That was very unfortunate. Jones didn't really get to play for you. You just downgrade a draft pick, and you don't get anything out of it, really. So not really a great move there. So yeah, not great stuff there from the free agency and trade side of things. Now, with extensions, there's some solid hits in here. There's also some misses. Joshua Hines-Allen, I think this year he took a little bit of a downturn, but still, he's a great pass rusher. He's a really good player. I think you have to have him on this team, and so I don't really regret the move. And I give it a B- just because you consider when we made this move, and it was handled a lot better than the actual Jaguars because they end up not being able to tag Ridley because of it. And to be fair, that worked out in their advantage. Yeah, they lucked into Brian Thomas Jr. because of it. But the logic of it was very poor, and they just ended up getting super lucky. But we flipped Calvin Ridley for a third, right? A fourth, that was. We didn't have him in our long-term plans. We got something out of him. And so this extension, I think, was good because it enabled you to do that, and you're still paying the player what they're worth. Tyson Campbell on the other side. This one I gave a C for now. Something that's important to note with Campbell. The more I've looked into it with him, I think he's being used very poorly by this team right now. Because when you look at his grades, you look at how he plays and where he succeeds, he is a zone coverage corner. Every year in the NFL, he has graded below average in man and above average in zone. Every single year of his 4-year career. We are paying him to play in a man coverage scheme. That's not a fit, right? And that's a mistake I made here too. And with Ryan Nielsen, I don't think there was a way to necessarily predict he wasn't going to be a lot of these things he was supposed to be coming in. And there's off-field things that I hate it for, honestly. Like, I don't want to sit here and dogpile on the guy because he's got, I think his wife had cancer or something terrible like that. It's those types of things he's dealing with in his life that I get why you struggled. But from a scheme standpoint and what he brought to the team and the type of players you had and you invested in, it just didn't make sense. I think this team needs to run zone, just considering what Campbell's good at. He's the big investment. And you also look at who we have otherwise in that cornerback room. It really, zone fits about everyone there. So I gave it a C. I think it's going to look a lot better in the future once you get back to a scheme that fits him better. So that's something to consider here. Now, Andre Cisco, this contract, not really that great. I think you wish you waited. But I do have confidence in Cisco long term. So I'm not going to give it a terrible grade. It's going to get a D+, but you definitely wish you had waited and maybe gave him a 1-year deal to try to prove himself. And to be fair, if he proves himself on that 1-year deal, you might be paying more down the road. So if you're right on this, it's a good situation. It's just, obviously, Cisco didn't have a great year. Now, Foye Oluokun, he had a solid year for the Jaguars, still playing well. I will say, at this point, he is not the top linebacker for this team. I think it is Devin Lloyd. I think Lloyd's played great football this year. He's consistently been one of the highest graded players. You watch him on film, he's made some big plays. He's had an impact. The only question with him is coverage, and he's still at least been average or even sometimes above average in that area. So I think this is a situation where, depending on the scheme, Oluokun might be someone that you're getting rid of early, but you're still getting good play. You paid him less money, and you're happy about that and how that's turned out. So I'm a fan of the extension still. I just think that it's very possible he's a player you eventually move on from. Now, Ezra Cleveland, I probably would have had a higher grade on him before. And he had some great moments early in this year, but at the end of the day, he kind of struggled down the stretch. He wasn't always that dominant run blocker you wanted to see. Far better in pass protection, of course. But ultimately, I think you're kind of getting your bang for your buck and a little bit more. So it is a good deal, but it's maybe not the home run that I originally had thought it was. I'll, of course, go back. I'll watch film on him this offseason because we want to make investments on this offensive line. That's a big thing, a big emphasis that we're going to have in how we do this in 2025. So Ezra Cleveland, considering it's a tradable contract, he might not be guaranteed to be here next year. So I didn't give it an A just for those reasons. We'll see what happens. Cam Robinson here, I could give this even a lower grade, honestly, but he just hasn't played well this year. He has not been a good football player. He's not been a good starter. We did trade him, and thankfully, the way the contract was, I think we got a good deal out of it with Minnesota. It's a little different than the real life one. We end up getting their third, flip them a fifth. So I think that's going to be a little bit better. But at the end of the day, you just wish you didn't pay him, and you probably wish that you kept Walker Little on this team, to be honest. I think that would have been a better situation for the Jaguars, and you obviously see Walker Little getting the extension in real life. Now, do I think Walker Little is an elite level player? No, I don't think that. But is he a solid left tackle? For sure. And so I think that would have been a better investment, giving you better options, and you would have saved more money. So I have some regrets there. I think with the Cam Robinson deal, I think it was a little bit of overspending, but at the end of the day, it isn't the worst thing in the world. You get something in return, and that is a third round pick that you can use in this next draft class. Now, final one here, Dawuane Smoot. I don't know if anyone's really followed him this year because obviously he's not in Jacksonville anymore, but he did have a solid year for the Bills, just kind of getting back a little bit to what he was doing most years. So he's a good depth pass rusher. I think that's fine. And so I gave him a solid grade there, just to see. You could also add some other players on here because, for example, like we had a Carl Lawson that we added this year. He had 6 sacks on the season. So there are some other guys we added, but these were the main ones from the offseason. And this was the extensions, of course, more so. Lawson would have gone on acquisitions. But ultimately, it's hits and misses, I think, with what we did with the players who are currently here. Now, talking about the draft, a little bit of a change in tune here with some of the players. Jer'Zhan Newton, it's really hard to know what's going on right now because you've had some play that's very disappointing on the field. At the same time, you've had some big games, and you have the excuse that he really didn't get to prepare for the season because he was hurt. His first real action was in week 2 against an NFL team. This was not a guy who got a full offseason to prepare. And so I think he will be a better player next year, and that could be a really good defensive tackle for this team. But obviously, it's not a great first year. You have your reasons, but you're going to have to see improvement down the road. And if not, it's a really unfortunate way to kick things off because you look at the Jaguars, they made one of their best picks in franchise history with Brian Thomas Jr. For myself, I like to think I've had some good opinions on the first round. This might be a miss. We'll see what happens, but it's not a Brian Branch type of pick that I would have made where he's like an all-pro safety or an all-pro slot corner. Like Newton did not have a great first year, so we'll have to see what happens. But the guy who did have a really good first year looks the part and really changes the mentality of this offensive line and just fits everything you want to bring in, right? He's the guy in the background here. It's Jackson Powers-Johnson. I knew at the time of the pick this was probably going to be the best selection that we made in the entire draft. Hard to imagine anything else. He has been really good for the Raiders, and he looks like he's going to be one of the best centers in the NFL. It was really important to me to be able to get someone who is going to come in and set the physical tone for this offensive line and just change the mentality that they have, because this is not an offensive line that has been physically dominant against opponents. We have not seen much of that. So getting in Jackson Powers-Johnson was huge. It's a player I liked a lot. He fell down the board. He was thankfully healthy throughout this whole season. He played really good football for the Raiders and would have done it for the Jaguars here as well. So you can look at this now. You can go into an offseason where there's not really great candidates at center, and you don't got to worry about it. You have your foundation in the center of this offensive line. So I gave it an S tier grade because I just think he's that good of a football player. Now, Javon Baker and Devontae Walker, I've kind of grouped them together when talking about them. Baker, he had some problems in New England. Some of it's Gerard Mayo being a moron. Some of it is apparently Javon Baker not knowing what routes to run. So there's that question. And it's been a very slow start for him. He got his first reception in Week 18, so that's surely not a hit for this team. And then Devontae Walker, he did get a touchdown this year. That was nice to see, but he's been limited a lot to special teams. I think one thing that's really going to haunt me here, which is very unfortunate, Jalen McMillan, who was originally who I wanted at 96. That was who the pick was going to be. I sat put. I didn't think I'd have to trade up for him. He goes at 91 to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And what did Jalen McMillan do this year? He played really damn good football, turned it on down the stretch. Would have just been an awesome fit. And I think locked down one of the positions on this offense and kept you from potentially having to spend big at wide receiver this next year or invest another draft pick there. Because you look at Baker, you look at Walker, and I can't confidently say that those players are going to be to the caliber that they need to be. I can't really sit there and bet on them enough. So that's the issue there. It's very unfortunate. If I could, I'd trade them both for Jalen McMillan, but that's not an option at this point. It's just very unfortunate, I think, how a lot of these things turned out. Now, Michael Pratt, once again, the only reason I give this an F is because you could have had him for free because he went so late in the draft and he got dropped by the Packers. So that's factored in the reason why there's not going to be a higher grade. But I still think he's going to be a solid backup quarterback long term. I think this is where you take that kind of guy. So if I'm not factoring in that he was cut and available and still would have been available to the Jaguars late in the season if they just wanted to add him to the roster, then I think Michael Pratt is probably just a C. Right? He had moments in preseason, he looked good. Had some moments where he didn't. It's exactly what you expected out of him. Now, TJ Tampa, I think this is maybe a little bit unfair, and this should probably be more of a TBD sort of grade, but he just didn't really do much this year. He didn't really get on the field for the Ravens. Didn't fit the scheme. He's a zone cornerback, and that's another reason why a scheme change would make a lot of sense. He's another player that fits, that maybe you get something out of him. But Tampa just didn't do anything his first year. And so you got to ask, is he going to get on the field with the Ravens? Is there a plan for him? Or is this going to be a guy that just really isn't going to do much of anything? We'll have to see. The final pick we had, though, Leonard Taylor III. This is one of the best picks we had from this class. Of course, it's at 180. But Leonard Taylor III actually played really well for the Jets this year. He did a good job as a pass rusher, got some sacks, had good production, and I think he's someone who deserves more time on that defensive line, playing more for the Jets, and would be absolutely a critical part of the rotation for this team going forward. He's ultimately right now the second defensive tackle for this team. So it was a very good acquisition. I thought he fell way too far. He shouldn't have been a UDFA. So we pick him up here. I know technically that means, hey, you could have just signed him for free, but you don't know that he would have chose the Jaguars over the Jets. So given that information, I think that Leonard Taylor III was a fine draft pick where we took him. Now, UDFAs, Braden McGregor, he played a little bit earlier this year, played fine, and then kind of went to what you'd expect, below average, because you're a UDFA, right? There's a reason why you don't go drafted. Frank Gore Jr. and Drake Nugent, unfortunately, never took a snap on the field. Those are guys who might get involved down the road, but they're probably people that are going to be on the practice squad in the future, or maybe just the very bottom of the roster. It's kind of impossible to give a grade when you don't see them on the field, which is part of the reason why I was saying with TJ Tampa, maybe you don't give him an F, maybe you give it a TBD. So those are final draft grades. I'll make it pretty clear. This was a lot more disappointing, I think, the first year than what you want. I think you want better results. I think there's some things that are just bad luck. But I think there's some things that you got to kind of change your mindset on and how you draft for players and who you acquire in free agency and the kind of money you spend and where should it go. So that's something I'm definitely looking at because this is, at the end of the day, whether it's successful or not, a learning experience for myself and a way for me to try to have better opinions and better insight for the actual Jaguars. Now, with that said, we are going to take a look forward here. We're going to take a look at the 2025 offseason. This is, I think, where things get a lot more exciting because, once again, we're not talking about tearing down this roster and trading players and all those things. This is the time where we're going to start adding on, right? This is where the plan gets formed. This is where the team gets built the way you want it to be built. This is when you get your next leadership for this team, the head coach, the new OC, the new DC, all those things. So looking forward to the next offseason, projected league salary right now is around $273 million. We'll see where that falls. But ultimately, we're in a good cap situation. And this is in spite of moving money forward to get it out of the way in 2024 and 2025. When I came in here, there were still a lot of voids with this team down the road. And one of the first things we did was try to get those out of the way so that we're in a healthy situation once we have this team built the way we want. We want to build this young, want to hit through the draft, we want the team to be built primarily through that. And so this will be the last year where we have a lot of those big dead cap hits. I think Evan Ingram is a great example of one where he's got like 5 or 6 million extra on the cap this year just to get out of the way in the future because we don't have to spend all that money right now. So even with all that, we are expected to have $37 million to spend. There's players you can move on from. I think Greg Newsome is an example of one. If you can get a trade done for him, even if you got to flip a team a pick or ask for nothing, you probably want to get out of that contract. You also have Christian Kirk, who's a player who has no guarantees, has a high salary cap hit, and he's someone that, got hurt last year. He's been hurt 2 years in a row now. So can you pay that with Parker Washington on the roster? Right now, where things stand in the value of the roster, and this is based off APY, this is significantly less than what you're given to spend. So there's money to put on the table for some players this year. That's very much an option. So free agency could get interesting. The players leaving, there's not a whole lot. As you can see, it's about 20 million, and a lot of that is just players who are worth like veteran minimum leaving and having to fill that out because we don't have 53 players under contract yet. The APY of the draft class is going to get a little crazy because you got a lot of picks here. You look at them at the bottom of the screen. Your black ones are the ones that are finalized as far as I know. The ones in yellow are the ones that can move. So, like, for example, 88 is the Minnesota Vikings third rounder that we acquired. I don't know if they'll actually get knocked out this round. I'm guessing they do to the Rams, and if they do, they'll pick at 88. If they don't, might pick somewhere else. But this was just my best guess at where they actually end up landing. So we have a lot of draft selections, and with that, it is going to cost some money because the early selections, you can get players who get paid $10 million on average a year, right? You're picking first overall right now, so that's going to cost a lot of money. Look at the needs for this team. There is a lot to talk about. We got rid of a lot of players. This is a big reset. And so you look at this team, I think the top needs, you don't have a left tackle. You don't have anyone you really trust there. Wide receiver, it's Parker Washington and John Mechie. Is really the only guys you have any sort of reliance on, and neither of them have proven to be a great starter. I think Parker Washington, I'd have more faith in being the starter long term, but you have to add something there. You're going to need a defensive end opposite of Josh Allen, and that could be an outside linebacker too, depending on what the scheme ends up being, because the scheme is going to change. Cornerback, you're going to need someone opposite of Tyson Campbell. Look at right guard. You're not going to have anyone there. You could bring back Greg Van Roden, but you want to upgrade. Nose tackle. You lost Devon Hamilton. He was a trade candidate, so he's not on this team. You need a replacement. Strong safety. If you don't believe in Antonio Johnson, you're going to need someone there. Nickelback. I mean, if Greg Newsome isn't an answer, he's not going to fit the scheme if you bring in someone who runs zone. That's another need. Running back, Tank Bigsby. Is he enough there? And then tight end, I think you need to bring in depth because Brennan Strange is not on this team. So there's a lot of positions that you're going to need. But you have 14 draft picks. You got a lot of money to spend in free agency. I think you can definitely address the vast majority of these. It's just going to be kind of scary until that actually happens. You see on the right the actual teams we're acquiring these from, so it's a good way of looking at it. Ultimately, this is 14 draft selections. There's a lot to work with. You're going to have the first overall pick. Why the guy's in the background that's in the background, right? Travis Hunter is a very obvious candidate to go after, and I think the question is going to be, can you acquire Travis Hunter and maybe even trade down the board? Do you look at some of the teams who are picking after? We'll take a look at that here towards the end, but it's possible you could do something like that. With that all said, we're going to talk really quick about some of the candidates for this head coach position. We're going to talk about the defensive coordinator as well, special teams, and then just finish off with some questions and some final numbers from the year. So, head coach candidates. I'm just mainly talking about top guys for me and then who I would also consider. So, right now, there's two guys who make a ton of sense. It's Ben Johnson and it's Liam Cohen. I would prefer Ben Johnson, and I hope he's the head coach. I think both these guys could be wildly successful with the Jacksonville Jaguars, and hopefully they get one of them in real life. The question is if Ben Johnson's going to come. And that's going to come down to weighing in if he would work with an established GM, because that is the role I'm playing here. Now, consider, it's a different thing to talk about Trent Baalke and what I would be doing, because Trent Baalke is not going to work with Ben Johnson and do what he asks, right? If Ben Johnson asks him to build an offensive line that can run the ball, we know Trent Baalke doesn't do that. He's had 4 years here, and we can't run the ball. So that's not going to work. Whereas with myself, my priorities and what I would be investing in are going to be very aligned with Ben Johnson and Liam Cohen. And so I think that's something that could work out. You also got to ask the question, is there going to be another team that has a more compelling case? Because there are differences between this team and the actual Jaguars. You don't have Brian Thomas Jr., right? You're going to have to get in there pass rusher. But at the same time, you do have Jackson Powers-Johnson. You have more draft picks. You have the first overall pick. You have a better cap situation. There are things that are better and there are things that are worse about this. So it's a question of, would Ben Johnson do it? And I think he would. I think that's the way things are going to go. I think it's just a matter of seeing what actually happens and if this would work out. So that's where I sit on this. Other guys to definitely consider that will be thought about are Aaron Glenn and Joe Brady. I don't prefer to have a defensive mind as the head coach because I'd rather have the offense set in stone for the long term. But Aaron Glenn, I think, is a phenomenal head coach candidate for the defensive side. And Joe Brady's kind of that third name with Ben Johnson and Liam Cohen. Never really talked about above them all, but you have to take note of what he's done with the Buffalo Bills. Now, defensive coordinator. I've got my eyes on one guy right now. There are other people I'd consider too. I'll do my research, but the guy I'd like to get in here, I don't think anyone's going to notice him off this picture, but that is Jim Leonard. He is the defensive backs coach for the Denver Broncos. He was going to be the defensive coordinator originally for Sean Payton in 2023. He wasn't able to take the job. I think there were personal reasons involved, something along those lines. He even had an opportunity before, when he was in college, to be the DC for the Packers. So there's been NFL interest in this guy for a long time. He finally took the leap to the NFL this last year. Obviously, Denver has had a phenomenal secondary. It hasn't just been Patrick Surtain. So I love what he could do there. I think it's very enticing as well to say to someone like him, hey, if you come to Jacksonville, we're going to get Travis Hunter in the draft. You're going to have Tyson Campbell opposite of him. You're going to have pieces to work with on this defense. And we could even, be talking about what pass rusher are we going to go get? Because you look at these draft picks we got, we have the trade capital to go move up and get another top player if we want. We'll talk about that here a little bit at the end. But I think it's a compelling job for him. I think he's clearly invested in the NFL now. Vance Joseph, I don't expect to go anywhere in the NFL, so he's going to be their DC. So you're going to have to get your opportunity outside of Denver, and Jacksonville makes a lot of sense. Now, there's also the argument for Robert Saleh and even Lou Anarumo, because these are guys who they're not going to get head coach consideration eventually, whereas Leonard is someone who'd be an up-and-comer, could be considered for that eventually. So you're safer keeping those guys. At the same time, if you do get someone who's promoted from your team to being a head coach elsewhere, you get a third-round draft pick. You get something in return. So if you can hit on defensive coordinator and get the right people, that's a way of getting extra draft capital. That's something we've seen teams like the 49ers do, right? We've seen the Los Angeles Rams even able to do it on the offensive side of the ball with guys like, for example, Kevin O'Connell. So it is possible to make that work if you make the right decisions. What I love about Jim Leonard compared to these candidates, I've listened to interviews with him. I think that the leadership is phenomenal. I think the kind of mentality he brings is phenomenal. And I think the scheme he has is a perfect fit for the players that are on this roster and the players I would like to acquire. Because he is the way Jim Leonard runs things. He runs a lot of, and this is from his days with Wisconsin, because he was the Wisconsin defensive coordinator for a long time, running the pro-style defense. He was an interim head coach for part of a year. Didn't end up getting the long-term head coaching job, but took over for a bit. Jim Leonard, he's someone who runs a lot of packages where you're going to have nickel corner, you're going to have three men on the front. So you see a lot of like 3-3-5. There's even some 2-4-5 involved where maybe a defensive lineman is replaced with a linebacker and different things. So there's a lot of variety in his coverages, but he's going to run with outside linebackers, stand-up pass rushers. You look at what Josh Allen has done in his best year. He's played a lot under that type of scheme and been successful, right? I think he can do both. I think he can play 4-3, but that's something to consider. Jim Leonard is also someone who is a zone coverage defensive coordinator, so he's going to run a lot of that scheme. You look at the players we talked about again. Tyson Campbell. You look at even Monteric Brown is someone who's done better in zone. He's become a very smart player. He just doesn't have all the athletic traits to keep up with guys. So that's a problem. That's one way you can help him is having zone coverage where he's been successful. Look at TJ Tampa. He's not someone I'm surely planning everything for, but maybe you get something good out of him going to a scheme that fits. So he makes a lot of sense as a fit. You look at even Travis Hunter as a player. He can do it all, but zone is where he's at his best because he's a super instinctual player. So that all fits. And then I'll throw out a couple names we're looking at in the draft. And there's a lot of time for things to change. Doesn't mean these are going to be the draft picks, but two players I really like as replacements for Trayvon Walker eventually. Abdul Carter is the top one. If you can't get an early pick, Mike Green is the other for Marshall. Both of those players are stand-up pass rushers, and Abdul Carter has experience playing linebacker, dropping into coverage. He is a stand-up type of pass rusher. If we were to sit here and say move up from 18 with the draft capital that we have, which we can absolutely do, and to go pick up Abdul Carter, and you make a big swing like the Texans did, and I don't even know if you'd have to give him first. I think you could give up a lot of other picks and make it happen. you could get Abdul Carter here, have him in a perfect situation for the way he plays. You got Travis Hunter in the perfect situation for the way he plays. And you fit the scheme for everyone already here. And now, all of a sudden, just those two acquisitions, your defense is very quickly loaded. And I think that's a compelling case for how Leonard would fit. And at the same time, why he would want to come to Jacksonville. So there's my long rant on the defensive coordinator, but I think it's fair to talk about him, and especially, given the Jaguars might get a different DC this next year, this is a candidate I would be considering for them. Now, special teams. Heath Farwell did a great job this year. He's a good special teams coordinator. He doesn't need to go anywhere. You can sit here and you can say that we didn't clean house and all that. It's a half measure, right? I'm obviously joking when I say that. But this is a good half measure, right? Or third measure, I guess, or 2/3 measure, whichever you'd say. But Farwell's done good at his job. He's got 2 Pro Bowlers on his unit with Logan Cook and Ross Matisic. So good stuff, right? Ranked 5th per PFF for special teams this year. It's been a great unit for the Jacksonville Jaguars. So I very much think that he's a guy you got to keep around with the real life team and with this situation as well. Now, we're going to wrap this up. We're going to look at some burning questions going forward, and then we're going to take a look at some of the final cap numbers from this year, draft order, just some things like that, because there are some differences to discuss. The burning questions, some of these we've talked a little bit about, so we'll run through some of them quick. The first thing is obviously who's going to be the head coach of the Jaguars. So that's top priority. After that, the biggest question for this whole next year is if Trevor Lawrence is going to be the long-term quarterback, because we didn't take the approach of just paying him for what you hope he is, because that's what the Jaguars did. It has not worked out so far. Now, it could be best-case scenario still, because say they get a great head coach next year, and he's successful with whoever, then you're glad you paid him. But I think that the extra cost you pay is worth it to make sure you make the right decision. And the fear here is obviously, would he play on a franchise tag? I don't think he would, unless it's the right situation. So you pretty much have one more year to figure this out with a whole new staff on the offensive side of the football. That's a scary question, because it is really open to what happens there. It is not a definitive Trevor Lawrence is going to be here for the next decade plus. You don't know that. So I hope there's a very clear answer to this question in 2025, because 2024 did nothing to answer it. It was basically just a year where you saw the polar opposites. You saw the up and the down, and then he got hurt. In his last game, he looked really bad in that game before he got hurt, to be fair. Who is the successor to Trayvon Walker? Kind of threw out some names, obviously, with Abdul Carter, Mike Green. Maybe you're out spending on someone in free agency. I'd prefer not to, just because I don't love the names out there. Maybe there's a trade candidate, but that's going to be a big question, because that is a huge need, and the trenches are a top priority, right? We want to be physically dominant there, and you can't do that without having a great pass rush. So it's important to find that player, and I think those are some of the early favorites to do it. The identity of the Jaguars, just said it, right? We need to establish that, and I think that is being a physically dominant opponent in the trenches. There's other things I want to be great at too. You want to have a great passing attack. You want to have a good run game. You want to have a lot of turnovers on defense. But the identity of what you want to do, the crux of it, is to be great in the trenches and to wear out opponents in that way and make them not want to play your team. Now, next question. Should the Jaguars spend big in free agency? I am generally someone who is against spending a ton of money in free agency. I think it's a bad thing. I think you want to spend on your players who are on the roster that you drafted or you traded for if you can get a good deal for someone who made sense to bring in. So Ezra Cleveland, great example of that. Ultimately, though, there are going to be some very enticing options that fit needs, that fit the type of team we want to build. And it has to be considered, because there's a lot of money to spend. I was crunching numbers. And after cutting players that are expected to be cut, your spending could be 90 million under what you would expect to be at based off the APY. Not cap hits, but just what is the value of a player and how much are you given to spend that year. So you got to consider it. And the two players I look at as top options, T. Higgins is number one because he's worked with Trevor Lawrence. They had a great rapport in college. And T. Higgins, when he is healthy, is on a trajectory to be a legit wide receiver one in the NFL. You need that type of player. And if he gets hurt, you have people in place who can play the role. Devontae Walker would be a very good replacement if he's hurt. Now, I'm not saying he play the same level, but for the type of player that's there. So I think you have a very good plan if you brought in a T. Higgins. Of course, the question is, are you going to pay him what he wants? And what he wants is a lot of freaking money. It's like going to be close to 30 million at the end of the day. It could be up to 30 million. We'll have to see what it is. And will he even be available? The other guy is Trey Smith from the Kansas City Chiefs. Trey Smith, everything I watch from him, he's everything I want in an offensive line. He's dominant. He wants to maul people. He's great in the run game. He's a good pass protector. Just all around a great player who takes pride in his game. He will cost a lot of money, but he has been available despite the blood clot issues from college apparently being the reason why he fell. He's been available for basically every game in his career. I think he's missed like one. So this is a player who makes a ton of sense for the team. Would be the right guard, fits into the biggest need on this offensive line outside of left tackle, but will you spend the money? Because that will eventually prohibit things down the road. But you also got to spend because you don't want to sit here and have a 4-year rebuild just to be competitive. You got to get some players in. So it's a balancing act of what can you do, what can't you do. I think for me, I look at it like I want to get the bargain deals most of the time, but if there's these special opportunities for those types of players and I have the money for it, it has to be considered and it might have to be done. So that's kind of my thought there. Is Tank Bigsby the future starter for the Jaguars? You know, I think he's definitely a part of things, but maybe you're looking at making a big splash there. If you get Ben Johnson in, maybe you're considering Ashton Genty for running back. It is very much a possibility here, and he might be the player you want to take in the first round after Travis Hunter. You could also look at other players later in the class. You know, someone I'm a huge fan of is Kyle Monunga, and I think he would fit very well with the mentality that you want to establish, the type of runner he is. I think he's also a better receiver than what he gets credit for, and he's a hell of a blocker. You also look at players like Travion Henderson, who would be a perfect complement to what Tank Bigsby is. You could consider a Nicholas Singleton. There's Cam Scatabo. There's a lot of different guys that we could throw out in a very strong running back class. I think someone's got to be thrown in to add to that mix because you don't have anyone else right now you really believe in. Now, last couple questions here. Will the Jaguars make 14 picks? I think this is no, because the point of having this draft capital, you know, it's to have the flexibility to move around and to get the players you want, target them where they need to go, and have a draft class that ultimately defines this team for the next 10 years. Like, we want to get multiple players who are face of the franchise type of guys that when you think of the Jaguars, you're thinking of these guys, right? And that could be that Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter kind of pairing. If you go make a huge splash like that is in the cards to do. It could be Travis Hunter and Ashton Genty on the same offense. There's different things you could consider here, but I think it's important to move around and to use some of those picks to get up in the draft and get the players you want. On top of that, you know, looking at the next question, can the Jaguars trade down and still land the top prospect? I think you can, and you might have extra picks on top of what you already have, right? Because what's the cost going to be for the Giants at number 3 in the draft order to move up to 1, where you'd be comfortable saying, The Giants take a quarterback. The Browns take a quarterback at number 2. You're still getting Travis Hunter. You give up nothing. You pay him less money, technically. What are you going to get from the Giants? I mean, we all watched Hard Knocks last year, or you did if you like good shows. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. You can literally see a phone call of Joe Schoen, who was retained by the Giants, calling up the Patriots, wanting to move from 6 to 3, saying, would you do it for a first and another pick? Right? That could be a first and a second, or first and a third, to move up from 6 to 3. What's it going to be to go from 3 to 1? Now, different class, right? Different caliber of quarterback, perhaps. But ultimately, the value of picks is still generally the same. This is the first overall pick in a team that needs a quarterback. That guy might not be there, right? There might not be the third quarterback that they can rely on at 3. They don't know that you're not going to move out unless you trade with them. They might have to make that deal. So I think it's a phenomenal situation. I'm very grateful that the Patriots won their last game, because if they didn't, I don't know what you do, because they pick a number 2 in that case. So I'm really excited to see what you can do there. But I think you're going to have that draft capital as well. And that sets you up really well in 2026, because, you know, if things really do go south with Trevor Lawrence, now I got 2 first-round picks. I can go make a move up the board if I need to get the next guy. Or if it works out with Trevor Lawrence, well, I'm going to add 2 more big-time weapons to this team. You're going to have a lot of flexibility. And then the final thing here, is it possible to go from worst to first and make the playoffs? And I think this is a yes. I mean, it's a yes in most situations, but especially here. The Titans were the worst team in the NFL in real life. They are being run incredibly poorly. The Colts, every year, they collapse. They blow it late in the season. And they don't change anything. Right? Jaguars have the same problems, but we're not worrying about that here because we're actually trying to do the right thing. And then the Texans, I put out a tweet on Sunday, before the games were played or during them, that technically, if the Jaguars had just won the 2 games against the Texans, which keep in mind, the first one, Stroud scored a touchdown, take the lead, with 22 seconds left in the game. Okay? It went down to the wire. The second one, Jacksonville was scoring touchdowns nonstop, and if they got the ball one more time, they would have won the game. Okay? And that was with Mac Jones. This team, if they had won both those games in real life, they would have theoretically been in a situation where they could have made the playoffs in Week 18. With what record? Like 7-10 they would have been? They could have made it in. Now, obviously, the Texans won and it wouldn't have worked, but that's my point. For how bad the Jaguars were in real life, they were that close to being in the playoff hunt that late in the season. So with the Texans team that probably is going to do the same thing next year, that has real questions about how is Stroud performing now, is this division takeable? Can you turn it around that quick and be the winners? Yes. I really think that is in the cards here. So that's a big deal. We're going to have to see, of course, what happens. We'll have this whole offseason, but it is in the cards to have a quick turnaround like that. Now, before we get out of here, you want to take a look just at some numbers from this last year. Got this document. This is on Twitter. Also should be in the description for this video. I'll make sure to check and make sure it's there. But this is our spreadsheet for everything from the mock rebuild. I have hidden some stuff from 2024 just because the season's over. But looking at some numbers here, cap hits and kind of what we dealt with, tons of dead money, right? Because we made a lot of moves here. Ultimately, the spending, so what this is here, this is average per year. So this is the value of the player's contract that they're on. And we compare this to what is the total cap hit that you're given each year, not including rollover, but what does the NFL allot every team? Because that tells me if you're overspending, underspending, or spending what you should. So this hit, I had to add on a lot of these because unfortunately there were some pretty bad contracts left over on this team. And then some of this is just stuff that well, part of players we traded this year. So you have some big cap hits from that. But we underspent this year. That's a good thing. The amount of money pushed to the future, nothing too insane here. This is less than what it was originally. So we made some good moves there. End up having $3.6 million left to spare at the end of all this. Looking at 2025, where we stand, which we've got some players we can move on from, right? I mentioned Christian Kirk. You can save $16.5 million moving on from him. Greg Newsome, if you can trade him, over $13 million you can save. Marcus Davenport's going to be an obvious one, $6.5 million. You got some other names you could probably throw in from this list too. But right now, even not considering all those moves, we are currently $75 million under what we should be spending. So this is a very good situation. It means you have a lot of money. Some of that's going to go to the draft. Some of it's not. There's a lot of money to spend and make moves and really overhaul this team. Look at the cap hit, push to the future. Not a lot of big charges here, right? You have some on Heinz Allen. You have some with Luikon. You have some with Andre Sisco, right? And that's not bad stuff. This is a very good situation cap-wise. And you're getting these last, dead cap hits out of the way. Going to have some of them this year. As I mentioned with Evan Ingram, you have a huge cap hit because we're just trying to get these void years out of the way. Is there an incentive to that? Technically not, but I'm not really spending that much to where it matters. I just kind of want to get them out of the way for the future. So yeah, it's a good situation, I think, cap-wise. And you see this cap number down here, which is what you have available to spend. The draft order for this next year. This is how it turned out. So this is the order of teams. Some things are different because you have teams you lost to and teams you won against. So ultimately, we only lost to more teams. And that was the Colts, and that was twice to the Titans. And you see a huge difference here because, look, since we lost to the Titans, they're not getting their quarterback. They're not getting a high draft pick. They pick a number 9 because of that, because of how teams were so close in this race for the first overall pick. This really damned the Tennessee Titans and where they were. So that's huge, for one. And the Colts also pick further down the board because of the Week 5 game that I think they would have won. But this is your draft order right now. 19 through 32 is not set because the playoffs are beginning this weekend, so we don't know who's won, who's lost, any of that yet. But you have number 1, you have number 18 from Seattle for the Walker trade earlier this year. There's a lot of flexibility here that you can have because you say, what I was talking about with getting Hunter and Carter, you pick at number 1, you can flip back to 3 safely because Patriots is still behind you. Browns, all we got to do is make sure they're going to take a quarterback in real life. You get extra picks from that. Patriots, I don't think they take Carter as much as they should. It's probably someone like a McMillan to help out the offense. The Raiders, I don't think, would take Carter. They have Crosby there. They have other needs, other places they could go with that team. The New York Jets, number 6, might be where you can make that trade because I would worry about the Panthers most for Carter. But the Jets probably can't get their quarterback at this point. He's probably not going to be on the board. If they want a Milrow, maybe you want to move back to pick number 18. So there's options here, right? And overall, making those trades, you probably have more draft capital out of it, even after moving up from 18 to 6. So you see why I'm a little bit excited about the draft order here and how things could turn out. You have a ton of draft picks that you can see here, a lot of different trades that we've made. And then last thing I'll just look at, PFF grades from 2024. If you guys want to check these out for how the players perform, I did input all these. So, generally, there's a lot of lower grades this year because, not a ton of talent on this roster. A lot of guys got moved on from. It was a rebuilding year. Not really the expectation that it was going to be a top-tier team. But if you guys want to check out this document, you can do that. Should be in the description. It is also on my Twitter page. So make sure you go take a look at that if you want to. But with that said, that is all we got here. This wraps up year 1 of the mock rebuild. And this is something we're going to do for a long time, right? My goal is to do this every single year until there's a point where we just can't do it anymore. So, that could be 10, 20 years, depending on how long I'm on here. We'll see. But that is year one. So next offseason, later this year, sometime in May or June, we'll revisit this and start year two, talk about our moves and all that. If you guys have any thoughts on, just things you would have done this year for the Jaguars, who you would take as your head coach, your DC, who you want the team to do, who you want the team to add in real life, right? What would be your plan this offseason? All those things for the Jaguars. Love to hear it. I think this is a lot of fun. I enjoy it. It is a lot of work, of course, but I like doing these kinds of things and playing this stuff. So it's been a blast. But with that all said, I appreciate you guys watching and being here. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Real quick, we'll shout out our channel members: Premier Nasir 904, Mr. Dolphin, Scrubber Ducky 500, and Brian Foster. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. Appreciate you everything you do. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.